Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another Outstanding Authors at Google Talk. A little bit of an overcast day today, but we have a talk that will certainly brighten our afternoons. We're pleased to welcome Antonia Juhasz, who is a leading expert on oil policy and antitrust and international commerce as well. She is an associate fellow with the Institute for Policy Studies, a fellow with the Oil Change International organization, as well as a senior analyst for the Foreign Policy and Focus Group. Her master's comes from Georgetown, and she's also served as a legislative assistant for 2 congressmen. And so she'll be talking to us today about her latest book, which is entitled The Tyranny of Oil, the world's most powerful industry, and what we must do to stop it. This builds off her previous book, which was the Bush Agenda, and in both books she chronicles the rise of big oil. And as we enter a new world with a new administration and emerging technologies such as cellulosic ethanol and other technologies as well, what role will big oil continue to play in our future? Will it be the same as what it's been in the past 8 years, or will it take an entirely new direction? The gas prices might not be as crazy now as they were over the summer, but we definitely need to keep sustainability in mind as we move forward. So a few logistical portions of our talk. We'll have a Q&A mic at the end for the benefit of our YouTube and virtual audiences. So during the Q&A time, please use the microphone. And then we'll also have some time after the talk for a book signing as well. So please join me in welcoming Antonia.
So, thank you. I just ask on timing. When do we?
As long as 45 minutes, 50 minutes.
The whole thing goes until 3, and then we have time for questions. Okay, great. Sorry, just checking it on. Good. Well done with the turning it on just in time. Well, thank you all very much for being here, and I want to thank Google for having me and hosting me at the campus. I actually live in San Francisco, although I've been on book tour for about 6 weeks nonstop, so it doesn't quite feel like I'm back home, even though I am. But I was able to just take the train up from San Francisco and get to be here, which is great. And it's particularly nice to get to see the campus and to be with you all and to be at a place that is renowned for environmental sustainability and also your civic responsibility, and to be here talking about such a crucial issue at such a crucial time. And I put this in the context of Google's work in particular on environmental sustainability, because the nature of my book and my focus and reason for writing it was looking at where we are globally and nationally and locally as a people who have come to really understand and embrace the reality of the climate crisis in front of us. People now not only have made that big leap to accept that there is a problem known as climate change and that it is a serious problem, but more importantly that the vast majority of people have now come not only to acknowledge the problem of climate change, but to see it as a serious problem of which they want to see meaningful policy change put into place. Also, similarly, in terms of my motivations for writing this book, in the United States, we actually not even that recently now, not too long ago, surpassed the point where the Iraq War became the most hated war that we were in while we were engaged in a war. So the percentage of people who said while the war was happening that they opposed the war just became the highest percentage for the United States, for the US being engaged in a war. I can't find an easier way to say that. I think I've been talking too much. So in Vietnam, we reached the highest point up to that point of when people were asked, do you support or oppose this war? Vietnam had been the high point. Now the Iraq War is the high point. And we in the United States are very much opposed to this war, and of course globally there has been even significantly greater opposition to the war. And I look at these two phenomena and say, we've got opposition to these, we've got concern about very serious political events, very serious policy issues, and yet that concern is not yet translated in a meaningful way into meaningful policy. both on climate and in ending the war. And I see these two things as intimately related, as does our new administration. And the title of my book, The Tyranny of Oil, actually comes from the Iowa caucus when Senator Obama received won the Iowa caucus and gave his acceptance speech. And in that speech, he said, I will be the president who once and for all ends the tyranny of oil and ends the war in Iraq, and saw those two elements as intimately related and put them together in his speech. And that was received with a great wave of acceptance and response with the audience there, but of course, obviously with the entire nation as Senator Obama now becomes President-elect Obama. And as was said by Cliff in my introduction, my focus and my background is public policy. Both my undergraduate and graduate degrees are in public policy. I've worked for 2 United States members of Congress. I've worked for a number of nonprofit advocacy organizations, and most recently with the group, the Institute for Policy Studies, which is a progressive think tank. And it should give you the sort of sense of where my framing comes from. It's looking at what are the policies that we want to see obtained, and what are the blockages to seeing those policies go through. And the primary blockage that I'm going to be talking about and looked at in this book is that of the oil industry itself, and looking at the corporations, the individual corporations that make up big oil, and looking at them as policy actors. Who are they? What are their objectives? Where do they come from? Where do they hope to go in the future? And how do they hope to get there? And what does that mean for those of us who are concerned about many other issues, including climate, environmental sustainability, and war, and U.S. military policy? Because I don't know if any of you saw, you were probably at work, so you didn't, or you might have. President-elect Obama announced at a press conference this morning a number of his new security positions, in his new administration. And even in that press conference, he intimately linked the connection between energy policy and U.S. military policy, and that the two are intimately connected and going to need to continue to be seen as interrelated as he moves forward in his new administration. And so for those of you who are familiar with books on the oil industry and U.S. policy making towards the oil industry, there's really been a couple of different phases, but in terms of what we know about the industry, the last book written about the industry itself, as opposed to the sort of broader geopolitics of oil, of which there have been many, many fine books, is the book, The Prize, written in 1991 by Daniel Yergin. And The Prize is an excellent book. I highly recommend it. But one of the problems with The Prize is that, well, it was written in 1991, which is a while ago. And the other is that Yergin will be the first to admit that he really comes out of this industry. He's not so much a critic of the industry as someone who comes from inside and has a lot of knowledge to share from that position. But there hasn't been a critique of the industry really written since 1975, and that's the classic book, The Seven Sisters by Anthony Sampson. And so one of the things I set to do was as a critic to really shine a spotlight on this industry, understand these corporations, and pull back a curtain in a way that, in my mind, has not been adequately done in a very long period of time. And so the companies that I look at are the largest oil corporations, publicly traded oil corporations in the world, also happen to be the largest companies and oil companies in the United States. And those are ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, BP, Shell, and then Marathon and Valero. Now, BP and Shell, of course, are not American companies, but they have very large American affiliates. And more importantly, for my focus, they spend a lot of money on U.S. politics. They are very, very actively engaged in the U.S. political system and have a very large role in U.S. policy making. And why the subtitle of the book is The World's Most Powerful Industry and What We Must Do to Stop It is because I am equating profit with power. And I looked at these 6 companies and looked at their profits to try and understand their political influence, how it's exercised, and why they seem to be so successful in their policy-making objectives as opposed to, as I say, some of the many other policy objectives that we might have. And so I looked at these profits, and one of the things that is, I think, fairly well known is that ExxonMobil earned the highest profits of any corporation in world history ever, adjusted for inflation period, in 2003. They then topped those profits in 2004, topped them in 2005, topped them in 2006, topped them in 2007, and in the first 3 quarters of this year, Exxon has almost earned as much in profits as it did in the entire year of 2007, and that's $40 billion in pure profit. Chevron actually doubled its profits from the 3rd quarter of 2008 from the 3rd quarter of 2003, and has actually made more in the first 3 quarters of 2008 than they made in the entire year of 2007. But those are just 2 of the companies. And when you look at the profits for all of these companies beginning in the year 2000, and I'll explain why I focus on the year 2000 later, but beginning in 2000, there is absolutely no comparison, period, with any other industry. Nothing comes close. Your industry, not even a blip on the screen. Agriculture, defense. Defense was the one that I actually thought would be a high rival. I ran out of defense contractors, literally ran out of them, trying to get to the profits of just the top 6 oil companies operating within the United States. Pharmaceuticals, I don't know, think of an industry. Usually at this point people come up with illegal industries. I've tried to look into some of the illegal industries, and as best as we can tell, even illegal industries such as drug trade just do not come close. And the only industry that did compete for a time, not surpass, but compete, was the U.S. banking industry. And we all know what's happened to the U.S. banking industry. In fact, the only banks that have, the 2 U.S. investment banks that have survived the financial crisis thus far, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, fit into this story very interestingly because those are the 2 investment banks that have actually begun to morph into oil companies themselves. Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley own oil fields, they own tankers, they own pipelines. And they also happen to own the exchange on which the majority of crude oil futures are change hands, called the Intercontinental Exchange, based in Atlanta. So these 2 banks are a very interesting, a whole new development in the world of looking at the oil industry, because now banks and oil companies have always been very interrelated, interlocking boards, executives who move back and forth between the 2. This is a whole new phenomenon to see the banks actually becoming oil companies and what that means for the future and for policy making. But so we've got an unparalleled set of profits. And the year 2000 is important for a number of reasons. But I'm gonna go back in history just a little bit, because one of the things that's so interesting about where we are now with the results of the new elections is how similar we are in this economic moment to where we were about 100 years ago, both with the economy and with where we are with the oil industry. Because during the elections, one of the things that became increasingly constant was the use of the word populist in referring to the different candidates. So if you might remember early on in 2008, John Edwards was the candidate who was referred to as the populist candidate for president. Then Obama got the label the populist candidate for president. Then Clinton, then Governor Palin, then even McCain in his debates was being referred to as a populist. And one of the reasons why the populist language became so prevalent was because the economic moment was so similar to where we were 100 years ago during the populist movements, the progressive movement. And basically what was happening at that time, when we're looking at the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, was the rise of, for the first time in US history, the mega corporation. And the corporation that was the hallmark of this time and was the largest corporation in the United States and the one that set the standard, if you will, for the model that the other companies followed was Standard Oil, the largest oil company in the world and largest oil company in the United States. And across the United States, these populist movements and progressive movements were mass organizing of people, of unions, of parties. And their focus was, more than anything else, concern over the political influence being exercised by Standard and the other corporations over the government. And that the companies had been allowed to get so large that they were able to exercise political control over the government. And I'm actually going to read a political cartoon from this era. And this is a cartoon depiction of the United States Senate. And we see the seated senators, and towering above the senators, 3 times their individual size, stand grossly obese men who represent the corporate trusts. Each man is dressed in top hat and tails. Standard Oil, the most dominant, is the only company depicted by name among the trusts. Above them is a sign, and it's a huge sign, and it reads, "This is a Senate of the monopolists, by the monopolists, for the monopolists." And off in the far left-hand corner is a teeny tiny sign that reads, "People's Entrance," below which is a bolted and barred door marked closed. Now the concern, as I think is clear, is that companies had gotten so big that they controlled the government. And so the response was a mass people's movement. This was a time when there were literally thousands of strikes every year across the United States. People organized and they changed, they convinced the Democrats and they convinced the Republicans, and they formed their own parties, and they changed state law and they changed federal law. And while some of these movements were revolutionary, what they ultimately achieved was regulation, the very first regulations on US corporate activity in the United States. Such radical ideas like the 40-hour work week, the weekend, the 8-hour work day, the right to unionize, the rights to collective bargaining, the first campaign finance laws in the United States, and antitrust law. And it's been said that if the Standard Oil Trust was called the Standard Oil Corporation, we would have anti-corporate laws in the United States. But instead we have antitrust law. The focus was Standard Oil. And the ultimate achievement was, in 1911, the breakup of Standard Oil into 34 separate companies. The idea being that if a company had gotten so large that the government couldn't regulate it, that the company would be broken down into manageable size. And what I argue is that it's taken about 100 years, but through some pretty fundamental changes in US antitrust policy in particular, but also anti-regulatory policy, we have allowed these companies to merge back together with some of the largest mergers in corporate history. In fact, the largest merger in corporate history being the 2 largest post-breakup pieces of Standard Oil, Exxon and Mobil, which were allowed to merge. Chevron, which is the product of Chevron, purchased Gulf Oil. It then purchased Texaco, which itself had already purchased Getty. It then purchased Unocal. That's all one company. Conoco and Phillips have merged. BP bought Amoco and Arco. Shell is also the product of a number of other smaller mergers, and these are just the mega mergers, because in the US oil industry, just since 1991, there have been more than 2,600 mergers, just in the US, just in the oil and gas industry. And the goal of these mergers was essentially, and I'm skipping through a whole lot of the book and a whole lot of history for time, was essentially the need of the U.S. oil industry to reconsolidate itself after the nationalizations of their foreign oil holdings in the 1970s, and the need to reconsolidate and regain power across the United States. And that was through a process of massive consolidation of the U.S. refining market and the U.S. gas station and gas stations, the marketing side. So in the United States, we now have about 6 companies that control 60% of all refining in the United States. We have half as many refineries as we did in the mid-1970s. And the companies that own the refineries are able to exercise enormous political influence over the communities within which they operate because of their increased size and political influence. And we have about 50,000 fewer gas stations in the United States than we did in the mid-1980s. So for a significant period of time in the United States, we were producing cars faster than we were producing babies, but we have dramatically reduced the number of gas stations available to all of those hungry little cars. The reason being that the industry was trying to make both the refining sector and the gasoline marketing sector more profitable. And the other thing they tried to do through consolidation was to get their access to more oil, but also to make the oil that they had worth more. And that's another reason where the year 2000 comes into play. And I'm just going to mention this part really quickly. But essentially in the year 2000, we had the nation's largest oil companies teamed up with the largest banks and Enron to lobby the federal government for some pretty massive deregulation. And that deregulation took place after the 2000 election. So the 2000 election had been, until this year, the most expensive election for the oil and gas industry since we started keeping records. They spent more trying to get Bush and Cheney elected than they had spent on any other election, and they were successful. That record was just barely surpassed this year on the McCain-Palin ticket. But they got Bush and Cheney into office, and then during the lame duck period before Bush and Cheney came in, lobbied the federal government with the focus being on Phil Gramm, who was at that point the largest recipient of Enron money and the 3rd highest recipient in the Congress of oil and gas industry money, to deregulate a great swath of derivatives trading, which included deregulating some of the key areas that led to the subprime mortgage crisis, but also key energy futures trades. And the first casualty of this deregulation was the state of California and the California energy crisis. Was anyone here during the energy crisis? Good. So this deregulation is referred to as the Enron loophole, which is an enormous misnomer for a couple of reasons. The first being that loophole just sounds way too small, and Enron was only one of the beneficiaries, but it was the first and the largest beneficiary. And I'm just going to describe this quickly because it helps put into context what's happened with crude oil. So Enron was the first one to put this loophole into action. They set up Enron Online, and the state of California turned over our electricity to Enron all at the same time. And we now know, if anyone's seen the documentary Smartest Guys in the Room or was following the news at the time, what Enron did with that control over the California electricity market. One of the things we know that they did was intentionally created a false scarcity. They moved electricity out of the state. They manipulated the price of electricity. They sent it skyrocketing. The state's largest public utilities went bankrupt. We lost thousands of jobs. Probably many of you lived through, as I did, the rolling blackouts. We had people who were protesting on the street every day saying that this was manipulation, it was market manipulation. And we had policy leaders saying, oh, no, it's supply and demand fundamentals, it's supply and demand fundamentals, you silly protesters, shut up. Protesters kept protesting. And what we learned, and what we've now seen, of course, and I record them, are that the Enron energy traders were intentionally manipulating the market. And one of the reasons why they felt they could get away with it was because they were doing most of it on their own completely unregulated exchange, Enron Online. So their manipulation was exposed, and Enron imploded upon its own greed, but the Enron energy traders live on. And I don't mean that figuratively, I mean it literally. The same guys that were using the deregulation of the electricity markets in Enron Online to manipulate price for electricity are now working at Chevron, they're now working at BP, they're now working at Goldman Sachs, they're now working at their own hedge funds. And they are doing, have been doing, for crude what they were doing to electricity. Because also in the year 2000, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, together with BP, Shell, and Total, set up their own exchange, the Intercontinental Exchange, ICE, based in Atlanta, to trade crude oil futures on a completely unregulated by the US government exchange. The year 2000 is when that exchange was set up. That's the same year that the price of oil began its rise, but 2006 is the moment when the price of oil really skyrocketed. 2006 is also the precise moment when the number of trades on the unregulated ICE exceeded the number of crude oil trades on the regulated New York Mercantile Exchange. And the price went up and up and up and up. And the only other times in history when the price rose so rapidly was during the two 1970s oil crises, periods of intentional price manipulation, when OPEC was intentionally manipulating the price of oil for a political goal. And I argue that the price has been being manipulated for probably more of an economic motivation, but when an economic motivation that has very serious political costs. And that Senator Obama actually campaigned on the commitment to close the Enron loophole and actually start regulating this exchange. But so that deregulation made it possible, for one thing, for the price of oil to rise significantly and to rise rapidly. And it was that rising price of oil that really carried the profits of the oil industry with it and dramatically increased the amount of money that the industry had available to it. And one of the things I look at is all of the ways in which that money has been used to express the industry's political agenda. But let me just talk quickly about what that political agenda is, because probably you have seen, because we live in the heart of Chevron land. You all know that Chevron is based in San Ramon, not too far from here. And we've been in the midst of a Chevron media blitz, right? You can't open up a newspaper or walk by a bus stop without seeing the human energy advertisements that Chevron has. And Chevron has been very aggressively pursuing this media blitz. And part of the objective of the media blitz, and it's one shared by basically all of the companies now, is an attempt to portray themselves as embracing clean energy, as the Chevron ads show. The Chevron ads have the 3-bar Chevron logo, and interspersed in the TV commercials at equal intervals is wind, solar, geothermal, and oil. And they are equal parts, all of these things, right? And BP has their advertisements that show an oil drop, a sun, a wind. Also, it looks like they're all equal parts, these things. With the idea being that the industry is trying to convey to us that they understand that the world, first of all, is concerned about climate. They're very upset about climate, and they understand that. Number two, they get that they live in a world where oil is going to run out, right? It only seems logical that if you live in a world where we consume between 4 and 6 barrels of oil for only one that we produce, that if you live in a world where the vast majority of the world's oil is owned by governments and all of the world's oil is spoken for, except for this new, very exciting thing where in the Arctic, because of climate change and because of global warming, we now have this new pocket of oil that is sitting in the middle between Russia and Canada and the United States. And Governor Palin was right about many things, and one of the things she was right about was that from Alaska you can see Russia. And so all of these three countries are now going to war. We're not going to war, but we're seeing Russian ships and Canadian ships and Americans heading out to the Arctic and sitting there, flags in the ground, to say, who does this oil belong to, because we never anticipated that we would have access to it. So that's one of the only examples I can think of in the entire world where there is oil and we don't know who owns it. Otherwise, all the oil is spoken for. Most of it's spoken for by places that don't necessarily want to give it to the oil companies or allow them to own it. Or it's in very environmentally difficult places to get to. So it just seems logical that if the oil companies realize that we're facing this circumstance, that they would begin to shift into clean energy companies themselves and become equal parts energy companies and oil companies. And the reality, unfortunately, is not at all that. It's actually quite difficult to find out how much the companies actually spend on alternative energy and where the money is going in their alternative energy programs. And one of the best sources is their tax filings, which I've gone through. And what you find is that at very, very, very best, the very best company, which is BP, BP spent at best 4% of its total expenditures on alternative energy in 2006 or 2007. The rest were 2%, 1%, 0% for ExxonMobil in 2006. It then spent a teeny little bit in 2007. But they're essentially spending, I would argue, nothing comparatively on their alternative energy programs. And the reason is because they believe that they will be able to stay oil companies. And if you actually read their shareholder reports and their tax returns and their internal industry documents, they are very, very clear that they believe that they will be able to and intend to remain oil companies. And the way that they expect to be able to do that is that they will be able to use their political influence to get access to the oil that is left, and I would argue in the same time block our ability to use significant resources to shift ourselves into a green, into an embrace of alternative energy. So if you look at, for example, one of the laws that I go through is what happened with Proposition 86 in this state just 2 years ago, which was an attempt to tax the oil industry at its production here, with the idea being that the money that we got from taxing the oil industry would be used by the state to invest in alternative energy programs. And that ballot initiative became the most expensive ballot initiative in the history of the United States. $100 million was spent by the oil industry to defeat the measure. One of the reasons being is that California, you may or may not know, is the third largest oil producing state in the country. All of the major oil producers produce here: Exxon, Chevron, Shell, and Occidental. And they didn't want to pay this tax, and they also didn't want the precedent of a new tax on the industry in particular being used to fund alternative energy. So they spent $100 million to defeat the measure. They did defeat the measure, and it became sort of a classic study of the many ways of using money in a political environment where the mood of the state was very, very much for taxing the industry to shift money into alternatives, and yet the initiative at the end of the day was killed, with the primary, clearly the primary reason being the expenditures of money. So where the industry intends to get oil and to change policy so that it can get to the oil that is left is ways that have already proven to be successful just in the last year, and that are very important to us in California. So one was the elimination of the moratorium on offshore drilling. It was Chevron that really led the effort to eliminate the moratorium. Chevron has wanted very, very much to get far more aggressively into offshore drilling, particularly off of California's coasts. And I just read, when the moratorium was removed, the talk among Democrats was that they were going to let the moratorium fall for now. Remember, this was during the campaign. But that in the next year, they would, once they won the House and won the Senate, and if they won the presidency, then they would put the moratorium back. Well, I just heard read a statement by Senator Harry Reid that they're not going to pursue putting the moratorium back. And the moratorium on offshore drilling was put in place for a number of reasons, but let me just highlight one point about the reason why the moratorium is critical and why it stands in conflict with our concern about climate change. So just in one example of what's wrong with offshore drilling, any hole that is 500 feet or deeper, and what they are increasingly moving towards now is 1,000 feet, 5,000 feet, but anything that's 500 feet or deeper releases methane. Now methane, if it's not successfully recaptured and used to provide the energy for Google, when methane is released into the atmosphere, it is a greenhouse gas that is more than 20 times more greenhouse gas, 20 times more climate destructive than CO2. Every hole that they drill offshore at 500 feet or more releases methane. However, and the only place where we have statistics is in the Gulf, only about 20% of holes drilled actually yield oil. 80% are dry holes, but everyone that's 500 feet or deeper releases methane. That's one of the reasons why the Bush administration itself was saying it will take 10 years before we get any meaningful amount of oil from offshore drilling. That's because it is, in the words of a Chevron offshore drilling expert, I quote in here, a total crapshoot. It is incredibly expensive. It is very hard to predict where the oil is located, but it's very much in the interest of the oil industry, because wherever they can show that they are drilling for oil, whether they get it or not, gets included in their reserves. And for the oil companies, they want to show that they have very high reserves, which pushes their stock value up. The other place that they're looking is in the Midwest United States, in the shale regions of the United States. And another initiative that was part of the eliminating the moratorium on offshore drilling was eliminating a moratorium on shale development in the United States. Now, shale development in the United States, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, but also other regions, is very, very similar, and I'm going to talk about it together with tar sand production, which is the other area that the companies are moving aggressively into, and that's the tar sand regions of Alberta. Now, shale and tar are just like they sound. Shale, which is a rock, and tar, which is tar. This is, if you look at in Alberta, which is the tar sands, you're looking at, well, let's talk about shale. Shale is a rock that is found most often about 2,000 feet below the ground. You have to get the shale out of the ground, and what they generally use right now are traditional coal mining techniques, right? You eliminate whatever's above the ground, you get the resource out of the ground. Then you have to heat it, you have to crush it. It uses enormous amounts of water, it uses enormous amounts of energy to get the rocks out of the ground, to heat them, to crush them, to do all of the production. And they're talking about, because Colorado is coal country, adding new coal facilities or nuclear facilities. In Alberta, they're talking about building 7 new nuclear facilities to provide the energy to get at the oil production from these regions. So it's enormously energy intensive. And you get just, in terms of the shale, you get a teeny, teeny, tiny bit of kerogen, which can then be turned into a teeny, teeny, tiny bit of oil at enormous environmental and energy costs. And the same is true for the tar sand production. A teeny, teeny, tiny bit of bitumen leading to a teeny, teeny, tiny bit of oil at an enormous environmental cost. But that's not the end of the costs. Again, looking at Chevron, Chevron's Richmond refinery, which is, let's see, 16 miles away from me in San Francisco, so I'm not sure how much farther we are over here. But the Richmond refinery is a Chevron refinery that's over 100 years old. And the Richmond community has been in a constant struggle with Chevron over the refinery. But the latest struggle is over Chevron's desire, together with all of the major oil companies, to start burning their shale or tar sand oil, refining it at U.S. refineries. Now that's a problem because shale or tar sand oil is commonly referred to as heavy or dirty oil. It's not only environmentally destructive to get out of the ground. It's not only incredibly energy intensive to get out of the ground, but it is an oil that is laden with sulfur and other toxins. And it's heavy, it's dirty, the phrases that are used for it. And to refine it into gasoline, you have to break off all of that gook. And that has to be broken off somewhere. And it is broken off into the air, which makes it even more polluting to refine. And all across the United States, we have oil companies that are trying to convince local communities that they can refine that dirtier, heavier, more polluting oil without increasing pollution. And the reason why they're trying to claim that they can do that is because of some real ridiculous pieces of laws written into the U.S. Clean Air Act, which I won't go into. But there's right now a lawsuit between the local Richmond community against Chevron's plans for refining the dirtier, polluting oil within the Richmond community. So those are three environmental areas where the oil industry hopes and seems to be moving quite successfully in getting at in the future. The other is then, of course, getting your hands on the oil that belongs to the other people, right? There's the oil that belongs to other governments. And now we have had just about every world official you can name, but the probably most recent and most important was when Alan Greenspan, the former Fed chairman, wrote in his memoirs that he hates to have to say it, but everybody knows it, that the war in Iraq is about oil. General Abizad, who is the head of U.S. Central Command, said just over at Stanford, yes, of course the war in Iraq is about oil. Of course it's about that. How could we claim it was about anything else? And essentially where we are at this point is how or if a war for oil is going to be won. And that is the model that is being pursued is one that is in the form of a law that the Bush administration and the U.S. oil industry has been trying to get the Iraqis to pass for 5 years now, which would open up Iraq's oil to foreign oil company control and essentially achieve that end of getting oil that belongs to somebody else and turn it over to the oil industry. And that this is essentially a massive problem of influence that hopefully reached its apex during the Bush administration. The Bush administration, I think most of us know that President Bush, his work experience had been running oil companies. Of course, Cheney is the head of Halliburton, and Condoleezza Rice had been on the board of directors of Chevron for 10 years as the head of their policy committee. But these three were just the most well-known of what really were dozens of executives that moved in and through the Bush administration and really made it possible for the oil industry to stop lobbying and start legislating. And I go through in the book all the many policy changes that they made that now hopefully will be and need to be undone by the Bush administration. But it was a tremendous change of policy through international military policy, domestic environmental policy, and regulatory policy. And that brings me to the end, which is where I started, which is that just as we did 100 years ago, when we looked at the problem of an industry that had gained too much control and many other industries that had gained too much control, there were, as I said, revolutionary movements and revolutionary ideas, of which there are many today as well, and those may succeed and may happen. But at a minimum, what we can hope for now, and I think is very, very much within our reach, is a new phase of regulation, a new phase of regulating and taking a new approach to regulating this industry to free up the local communities across the United States, across the world, that are struggling head to head with an industry that has more political influence at this moment than it has likely had in the last 100 years, and that communities that are really in a life or death struggle, literally, against the industry, and freeing ourselves so that we can move forward and on the many of the amazing alternative energy programs that I know you all fund here and provide the brains for here, but getting at, again, where I started, eliminating the blockage of the political and economic influence and agenda of this industry so that we can free up our movement to alternatives, end wars for oil, and really begin to address the climate crisis in a meaningful way. So thank you all very, very much for coming and for listening. Thank you.
We have time for questions at the microphone.
And I look forward to your questions, and I look forward to signing the books as well. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Very interesting topic. I would say you forgot to mention Steve Levine's book, Oil and Glory, which is a great book about oil companies as well. But my question is, when you say manipulating the prices on ICE,
Yeah.
could you give us more detail? Exactly what do you mean by that? I mean, what is this manipulation that is going on, and how does it go around, you know, like free markets or whatnot? And I guess I'll take that.
Yeah, so the question is on manipulation on the Intercontinental Exchange. That's the exchange I mentioned, based in Atlanta, owned by Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, BP, Shell, and Total. So the first thing is the manipulation that we know about for certain are the manipulation of companies manipulating price, cornering the market on the regulated NYMEX, right? So we know what manipulation has taken place on the NYMEX because it's regulated and we can look at it. And I list all the companies that have been found guilty or have settled charges against them, and it's every major company on the regulated NYMEX. So we can look at the manipulation on the NYMEX and get a sense of what we can anticipate is happening on the unregulated, so we don't know what's happening on it, ICE. So the problem is, what are the potential problems are, what are the sizes of the trades? Who is behind which trades? What are the relationships between the trades? Do we have cornering of the market taking place? Do we have massive trading taking place? Do we have manipulation like we know that we have had on the home heating, what's home heating isn't the word I'm looking for.
Heating oil.
Heating oil. Heating oil markets with Amaranth Advisors, for example, which I go through in the book. And you know, do we have manipulation that is clearly focused on trying to move the price up? And we have the proof that manipulation has taken place in the NYMEX, but there's no chance for proof yet on ICE except for looking at what the market has done and how it is without relationship to the supply and demand fundamentals. And also you have, even without being able to point at specific cases of manipulation, you definitely have a problem of just an unregulated market with the price being allowed to rise and rise and rise and rise, with just the demand being created through the size of the
Wouldn't
trades.
that be good actually for CO2 because consumption would go down?
Wouldn't it be good for CO2? Yeah, so here's the problem. I think that the price of oil should be high. I think that the price of gasoline should be high. However, I think that I think that policymakers have to be very careful about how the price changes and what we do with the change in the price. So I think a high price of gasoline needs to be captured by the government in taxes, and I think it needs to be used to invest in all of the mechanisms that need to be put in place so that people can transition away from gas. So that's public transit and alternative energy. And also in terms of oil, similarly, the last time oil went above $100 a barrel, adjusted for inflation, was in 1981. The response was a massive global recession, which had dire, horrific human implications. Oil went to $100 a barrel in 2008. The result was a massive global recession, which was dramatically intensified by the mortgage crisis. But it began when the price of oil went up to $100 a barrel. And as policymakers, we have to figure out how to manage the rise, to make it so that economies don't crash as a consequence of a massive increase in price, right? So how to capture that money and invest it in ways that actually make it possible for entire economies to transition away from oil, to look at what are the political impediments and the economic impediments to transitioning away from oil, so that we don't have massive loss of life as a consequence of price being pushed up so that a couple companies and traders can make a lot of money. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
My question is kind of a basic one, but so in terms of the distribution of where these companies' profits come from, how much of it comes from things like gasoline, things like heating oil, things that your everyday consumer pays for,
Yeah.
and things that are larger scale that larger companies pay for? Thanks.
Their profits come from oil.
Right.
And so, but basically what they tried to do with the consolidation, and they did, was to make refining get them more money, which it now does. And so basically from the 1980s until very recently, the profit margin in the refining sector increased dramatically, and the same with gas stations. Gas stations essentially used to make them no money, and they turned them from pass-through operations into something that actually turned a profit through consolidation. And so they get money from gas stations and they get money from refining, but where they really get their money is from oil. And one of the things that we're seeing happen now with the economic crash is that the smaller companies, it looks like, are going to start getting bought out by the bigger companies. So Exxon and Chevron and BP in particular are looking around to start buying the smaller and the mid-level companies. These are pipeline companies, the transport companies. They're likely going to get bought now by an even increased vertical integration by the larger oil companies, which have sustained themselves and made their profits from their oil. So even though the oil companies only own about 13% of the world's oil, which doesn't sound like a lot, given how much oil is worth, it still yields a tremendous amount of profit for them. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. I would like to just comment that on top of very few books about the problem, there are even fewer documentary movies, but there is one by the name Gas Hole, one word,
Okay.
by Jeremy Wagner and Scott Roberts, and it was presented here last April. And it is both very interesting and very horrific.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Yeah, there's very few. There's who killed the electric car. There's very few. This is good to know about. Thank you.
Includes some details about killing, efficient cars.
Efficient cars. Thank you.
Thanks. I can't wait to read your book.
Yeah.
You mentioned that there was the only place you could think of where there was competition for untapped resource. It seems to me that there's also some disputes in the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea and at Rockall in the North Atlantic, North Sea, north of Scotland.
Okay.
And the whole question of whether or not the Caspian Sea is a lake or a sea, which would then determine who gets what. But another comment that I wanted to make about oil shale is that the oil shale development is in the upper reaches of the Colorado Basin. And the water of the Colorado River is already overclaimed by every state further down. And that the shale, when it's processed, actually expands, and it's 10% bigger. So even if you dig it out of the ground and try to put it back, you're still left with even more stuff. Anyway, sorry, those are the points. I want to ask a question now.
Yeah.
In terms of the US sort of energy corporations, do you want to speculate something on the sort of future competition as Chinese oil corporations, Indian oil corporations, and Russia begin to assert themselves in spreading influence for access to resources?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're clearly already feeling that, and that's so. One of the areas that I look at is U.S. the expansion of the U.S. military. So the expansion of the U.S. military under the Bush administration is the largest expansion since the Cold War. And if you look at where the expansion has taken place, a great deal of it can be tracked along oil transit routes and where oil is found. And one of the best examples of this, and something that I hope that particularly with the appointment of Susan Rice to the UN, that we're going to see a new focus, a new way of looking at Africa under the Obama administration, is the Bush administration just formally launched a couple months ago AFRICOM. So we have EURACOM, which is the European Central Command. We have CENTCOM, which is the U.S. Central Asian Command. These are centralized military command structures for those two areas, right? EURACOM and CENTCOM, the two areas where we fought wars. We now have newly minted AFRICOM, the African Central Command for the U.S. military. And the reason for AFRICOM, and I quote the U.S. generals in describing it this way, is largely for protection of U.S. oil resources in Africa. We have significantly increased our oil exports from Africa, but I would argue more importantly, we have a significantly increased U.S. oil presence, oil company presence in Africa. And we are going head to head for that oil in Africa with China. Chinese have traded oil for arms. The United States is increasingly arming Africa and now has this new centralized military structure for Africa. And what we are seeing is at this point now a almost proxy war for oil in Africa between the United States and China. And that situation is obviously already popped up in other parts of the world and is only likely to intensify as the Chinese and the Russians expand their own might and desire for and capacity to get oil with their companies and with their own financial means, which doesn't, in my mind, diminish the power of the U.S. oil industry. It makes it scarier because the less that we successfully transition away from oil and successfully, in my mind, diminish the influence of this industry on our policymakers, the more likely we're to see those contests go to the extreme. And the more the rise of conflict with Russia and China grows. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Hi.
I have a question concerning the natural demand, supply, and price of oil.
Yeah.
And the way I'll phrase this question is this. Assuming that if and when the oil market in the US gets properly regulated, whatever that means, what will be the price of oil 5 to 10 years from now?
If we have appropriate regulation, what should the price look like? There's enormous debate over that issue. But I think that most people agree that the price of speculation, depending on how you define speculation, has added between 25% and 50% to the price of a barrel of oil. And some people say 100% to the price of a barrel of oil. I'm not sure where it falls. What I think is that the price would be a lot lower were we to have a well-regulated market. But I would argue then that I would want the price to also be high, right? Again, but I would make the price high through taxation, and I would capture that price. But I would say speculating on the average consensus within the people looking at the market is probably about 25 to 50% is the cost of unregulated speculation on a barrel of oil. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks for coming over.
Thank you.
It's an enormously complex issue.
Yeah.
And one of the things that is interesting is how much time it took to explain what the problem is. And the solution to it, I'm not sure people are coming out and really saying what are good solutions. And one of them might be like an alternative tax or a tax for alternative energy with Prop 87, 86. But also I had the question of the oil routes where oil travels through tankers need to be protected by our military, a military. And how much does that cost us as US taxpayers to protect that oil? Mm-hmm. And how much is that as a part of the cost of a gallon of gas?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great, and I appreciate your premise. The entire last chapter of the book is alternatives and solutions. Throughout the book, I try and talk about and give examples of communities in particular that are organizing and coming up with creative ideas around the oil industry, but then also, alternatives for reining in the industry and what we do instead. This has been a challenge for me, I have to say, on this entire tour, is that there is so much that I want to lay out about the problem that it's hard to then give adequate amount of time to talking about solutions.
So maybe there's a second book coming.
So it's in there. It just doesn't come out in the talk. But there's also a number of really great proposals that just sort of simple ones that Obama has put out on the table. And this doesn't answer the whole problem, but they're good things for us to look at and make sure that the new administration does. And that is things like a windfall profits tax on the oil industry to be used to be invested into alternatives, and just increase corporate taxation more broadly, eliminating the large subsidies to the industry, about the $16 billion number that's put in place under the Bush administration to invest in, again, alternatives. But one of the things that actually I would want to focus on even more right now, given the state of the economy, is not just alternative energy investments, but I actually think what we really need right now is a mass investment in public transit and really, really making it possible to have the infrastructure put in place to shift us back to public transit. If anyone wants to, if we're listing movies, a good movie, Who Framed Roger Rabbit? The whole premise is going back to when Los Angeles had an excellent public transit system, which was then routed up and pulled out. The movie doesn't quite explain it in the breadth that you might want, but it's a nice humorous introduction to the fact that we used to have we used to have great public transit in many, many cities in the country that now no longer have it. And looking at our regulatory, taxation regimes, regulatory regimes, and just re-embracing the idea. I mean, Christopher Cox, who's the head of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, recently said, we've learned that self-regulation of corporations doesn't work. Sort of, oops, sorry. That just eliminating this idea that companies can regulate themselves, but also when we look at the problem of how do we move into the alternatives that we know we need, how do we stop fighting wars for oil, how do we address climate change in meaningful ways, to not just look at the original ideas that are out there, which we need to do, but also looking more concretely at what are the blockages to getting there, and the blockages to local communities, whether they're in Richmond or whether they're in Nigeria, who are trying to move into alternatives but can't because of the role of the corporations in their midst. And one of the things we call for is something called the separation of oil and state, calling on elected officials to renounce oil industry money and on individuals to pledge to vote for the least oily candidates out there. Those are two solutions for you. Okay. Thank you all very, very much. Thanks for coming. Thank you.